Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here. I'm back from the UK. I know I haven't put out all of my vlogs yet, but I'm working on them. There's a lot of footage to go through, and I have to do, music and narration and all that stuff. So, and I didn't have a lot of time to work on them while I was in the UK because, we were always doing stuff, and we were sleeping in a caravan, and I was working off of a laptop. So, there just wasn't, a lot of space to get things done. But I am working on those, but in the meantime, I figured I would make a little video talking about what I read while I was on the trip. As usual, because I was on the trip and we were so busy, and I was so tired at the end of the day usually, or, I would be like out with friends or whatever, I didn't have a lot of time to read, unfortunately. I read 5 books while I was on vacation, which isn't bad. Although technically, two of those books were finished while I was on the plane to and from England, so I don't know if those really count. But regardless, here's what I read. Starting off with this. This is The Amulet by Michael McDowell. This is a kind of a cult classic horror novel from the late 70s. Michael McDowell, of course, is a very prominent paperback original horror author. He sadly died of AIDS-related complications in 1999. These days, most people would know him as the screenwriter for Beetlejuice and a few other things here and there. But back in the 70s and 80s, he was all about the paperback originals. This was actually his first novel. I found this. I can't remember where I found this. I think I might have found it at a half price or one of the many bookstores I've been to. But this is one of those things where I was really, really happy to find it because this original edition is pretty hard to find. It's been reprinted several times, most recently, I think, by Valancourt. So the book itself isn't really hard to find, but I was really happy to find this original edition. I just love that painted cover. If it focuses. Well, I just love that cover. Oh, my bookmark fell out. Sorry. Yeah, I just love that cover, and the cover basically tells you exactly what it's about. It's about so it takes place in Alabama in 1965 in this town called Pinecone, and the mother of this guy named Dean, who's getting ready to go off to fight in the Vietnam War. He ends up getting his face blown off due to an accident while testing the rifles at this local munitions factory. And he ends up becoming, a vegetable of sorts, laying in bed, not moving or speaking. And his mother basically decides to kind of get revenge on the entire town of Pinecone by giving it to this woman. And she clasps it around her neck, and she ends up doing horrible things, and the amulet spreads to another person, and that person ends up doing something violent and horrible, and so on and so on. And that's basically sort of the overall premise of the novel. It's watching this town sort of descend into chaos as this amulet spreads from person to person. And the only person who can stop it is Sara Howell, who is Dean's fiancée, who's kind of dealing with the emotional fallout of what's happened to Dean and sort of the oppressive nature of her mother-in-law. And this was a really, really entertaining book. Due to the nature of what it is, it's very episodic. It's basically just a bunch of death scenes kind of like interspersed in between the main plot of, Sara and her sort of emotional journey. But it's a really, really entertaining book, and I think what sets it apart from other sort of others of these kind of like paperback originals is that there's a real sense of atmosphere and character. Michael McDowell grew up in the South, and so he really has a sense for the rhythms of the language and the way people talk and act, and kind of the emotional sort of resonances that run through all of these people's lives. There's a lot of stuff about sort of, because obviously this takes place in 1965, and racial tensions run high, so there's a lot of stuff about, sort of white and black, relations and how they all kind of operate among the town. And so, you have the poor and the well-to-do and all this stuff, and you have the tensions of the Vietnam War, and there's just a lot of stuff running through this book that gives it a sort of depth and complexity and texture that really separates it apart from your typical sort of cheap paperback original. On top of that, it delivers the goods when it comes to said graphic violence. The deaths are very, very creative. Actually, Michael McDowell built the book around the deaths, which, as I said, you can kind of tell with its sort of episodic feel. But the death scenes are so well done that it doesn't really matter. Again, I say this a lot with a lot of these paperback books, but it reminds me a lot of James Herbert. in the sense that, you have just enough on these characters to get to know them and to really feel who they are and sort of their lives and their dreams and their desires and things, and then they're just murdered horribly, and it's really awful and graphic. There's one death scene in here, one of the first death scenes, where an entire family burns down, and including the children and a baby, and it describes, the baby like going unconscious from, smoke inhalation, and the crazed mother kind of swaddling it, and it's burning, baby clothes and stuff like that, and it's really brutal. And there's another scene where a policeman's wife wears the amulet, and she ends up putting an ice pick through his ear, and it describes like the crunch as she like bears down on it with her hands. Like, it's some really, really brutal, gruesome stuff in this. But the heart of the book is Sara Howell and her sort of emotional fallout, as I said, of dealing with what's happened to Dean and the oppressive nature of her mother-in-law, who's very, fat and lazy and like refuses to do anything and is very manipulative and just full of rage. And you can really feel Sarah's like pain and anger and her sort of a desperation and her feeling of, like, what am I supposed to do now? Feeling trapped, So there's a lot of like just really good, as I said, a lot of really good character work and emotional stuff that that really raises this above your typical 80s horror paperback. And it all culminates in this wild climax that I won't spoil, but it gets really hectic and crazy. I mean, if I think this was originally written as it was sort of a spec script of sorts, where he was hoping that it would be turned into a film. And again, of course, Michael McDowell had a career as a screenwriter, so it feels very cinematic in that way. You can really see some of these set pieces in your mind, how they would play out, in a very like gruesome late 70s, early 80s horror film that sadly never got made. But it would be really interesting to see something like that. So yeah, I'm really glad I read that. I really need to read more Michael McDowell. I think this is the first book I've read by him, but I have a bunch of his other books. I know I have a copy of The Elementals and Cold Moon Over Babylon, which people say are some of his best. So I really need to read those, because this was really impressive, and I'm really glad I read it. So yeah, definitely need to catch up on that. So yeah, that was The Amulet. Next, this was a book I read on my Kindle, so I don't have it to show you, but I'll put up a picture of it. This is Last Courtesan of Olympus by Amanda Mewison. This is actually something that I started months and months ago, based off of Nicki's recommendation, and it was actually something that I started finishing before I left, because I wanted, it was, it'd been on my currently reading list on Goodreads for a while, and I wanted to finish it before I left. It didn't happen, unfortunately, but I did finish it, and I really enjoyed it. It's a male erotica, so I can't really get into the details about what happens in it, but essentially it's about a courtesan named Icos, who's, he's being raised through the temple of Aphrodite, raised to be used as a courtesan for, some rich nobleman, trained in the art of love, seduction, and he gets taken by the gods and basically says, like, hey, all of the male gods of the pantheon want to try you out, and you have to choose one of them at the end and decide to be, their courtesan, and you'll be, like, richly rewarded and all this stuff. So the premise of the book is it's essentially a series of short stories about each of Icos's sexual encounters with each of these Greek gods, and sort of what happens. As I say, I can't really get into the physical details of what happens, but I was actually surprised how much I really enjoyed this. I mean, as I say, Nicki recommended it to me, and I trust her taste. So this was very enjoyable. The thing that I really liked about it is that at first glance, it would just kind of come off as like a bunch of just random sex scenes with no real plot or through line. But the thing that I found really interesting about it was that it uses the sex as a way to kind of paint a picture of these characters and their psychological profiles and what they're going through and things like that. So, for example, there's a story with Cupid, or Eros, and, the story of, Eros and Psyche and all that. And how Psyche ran away from him and all that. So there's a whole thing where he's all about restraining Icos and not wanting him to being terrified of being abandoned and wanting control and stuff like that. And so Icos uses his sort of powers of seduction to not only to pleasure Eros, to give him a good time, but also to kind of like help him through his emotional turmoil and the things that are like hanging him, these sort of hang-ups that he has, sexually, psychologically. And he kind of does that for each god throughout the book. And the interesting thing about it as well is that each, as you can kind of tell from the Eros and the Eros example, is that each encounter is sort of related to the god's character and some of the famous stories that they've been involved in some way. Icos is kind of using his knowledge of those gods and their stories to sort of help them through these issues, as well as, pleasuring them. And it's almost like a form of like sex therapy, which I thought was really interesting. He's using his wiles and his sort of knowledge of the human desire and stuff, godly desire, to sort of help people through their problems, using sex as a form of healing, and I thought that was really interesting, and it was really, really well done. It's very beautifully written as well. So yeah, if you're into this kind of stuff, if you like, sort of gay smut, I think this is a really high quality one. There is a sequel, but it's not really related to the original story. It focuses on a friend of Icos. But if you're really into like Greek mythology, especially, I think you'll really enjoy how each story kind of plays into different Greek myths and things like that, and how it references them and builds on them, and uses them as this jumping off point to explore these characters' sort of sex lives. And it also has a really emotionally satisfying ending, because sort of the through line of the book is, with each god that he goes through, he's sort of thinking, oh man, how am I supposed to choose, which one I want to be the courtesan for, because it's like, I don't want to upset the other gods, I don't want them to think I'm playing favorites, I don't want to anger anybody. And the conclusion that he reaches, I thought, was very emotionally satisfying and very... just left me feeling, just very satisfied. I really enjoyed it. I do wish the sequel was more about him than his friend, but whatever. So yeah, thank you, Nicki, for recommending that. And I hope you guys check that out if you're into this kind of stuff. Next, I have The Last Chance Hotel by Nicki Thornton. Let me see if I can get this to focus. So yeah, this is The Last Chance Hotel by Nicki Thornton. This was one of the books that I found at a charity shop for like 50p or something like that, and it sounded good, so I decided to give it a try. Unfortunately, this was disappointing. But this is about a young boy named Seth Seppi who's working as the chef in this place called the Last Chance Hotel that's kind of on the outskirts in the middle of nowhere in a forest. His father used to work for the hotel, but then he ran off for some mysterious reason. We don't know why. And so he's sort of he's basically an orphan, and he's being mistreated by the hotel staff, and especially the hotel staff's daughter, whose name I can't remember at the moment. But she harangues him constantly, and he's sort of very put upon. And then the hotel is visited by this group of magicians and this guy named Dr. Thelonious, who's here to kind of judge all these magicians to decide if they can join this society of magicians that, again, I can't remember what it's called. It's been a while. But during the proceedings, when Dr. Thelonious is served the dessert that was made by Seth, he dies. It was poisoned. And so... he's been framed for the murder of Dr. Thelonious, and so he has to work with his cat Nightshade, his black cat Nightshade, who's able to talk, of course, to solve Dr. Thelonious' murder. That all sounded really, really good to me. I love murder mysteries, I love fantasy, I love books with talking cats, so I was really into this. But unfortunately, I just found it really disappointing. The main thing for me was that when I read murder mysteries, I'm not there so much for the mystery. I mean, the mystery is part of it, obviously. But I'm not one of those people who likes to read a murder mystery book and try to, kind of solve it and, find all the clues and all that stuff, I feel like a lot of mystery readers sort of approach these books like a puzzle to be solved. And that's kind of the main thing that they care about, and not so much about plot and character and atmosphere and that kind of thing. I'm more here for the plot and the character and the atmosphere, especially character and atmosphere. I think that's one of the most important things to me in murder mysteries. And to me, one of the most interesting things about murder mysteries are the potential suspects, because, you never know who you can trust. Usually they're a bit eccentric, or they have very like outsized personalities. I was really looking forward to that. And the suspects in this book are all, very eccentric magician type people, and they all have sort of Dickensian names like Professor Penelope Paperspook, Gloria Troutbean, Dorinder Dunster Dunstable, Angelique Square, Gregorian Kingfisher, Count Boldo Mered. They all have, Dickensian names like that. And they're all very sort of exaggerated and sort of cartoonish in terms of like how they look. Count Moret is like this big dude with like sort of gray skin and like scars. Dorinder Dunstable is this short little elfin guy with like pointy ears, and he's sort of very, very mischievous, and he's all about like illusions and like card magic and that type of thing. So there's like a lot of potential there, but unfortunately, none of the suspects really are developed at all. You don't really get to know any of them or what they're doing there or what they're interested in or anything. They're really just kind of props for the, to be red herrings for the mystery, But there's really never any sense while reading the book that any of them are really serious suspects. There's one or two that really get focused on, but the rest of the characters just kind of get shunted off to the wayside. And the characters that are kind of focused on just don't really come alive for me. Seth is, as you would expect from kind of being the main character of this sort of story, is a bit sort of generic, everyman, or very Harry Potter-esque in that, he's sort of an orphaned, character who's like very much kind of a blank slate for the reader to sort of, attach themselves to. But he never really develops much of a personality beyond being good at cooking. And none of the sort of major suspects of the book are really that interesting. And his cat, especially, I was really excited about his black cat, Nightshade. I love stuff with talking cats. And it kind of implied that, like, the cat was going to be there alongside him, kind of helping to solve the mystery. But the cat really only shows up, like, a few times to sort of, like, dispense advice and then spends the rest of the book sleeping. The only character that I really liked was the investigator from this sort of magical society who's investigating the murder, whose name's Inspector Pewter. And he's really interesting. He's the one who comes off more as like your typical murder mystery sort of investigator type, your Sherlock Holmes sort of Hercule Poirot type, sort of a little bit weird and eccentric. He's this big, tall, sort of, old guy with a big beard. You reminded me a little bit of Dumbledore in Harry Potter, actually, in that, he kind of dispenses a lot of sort of cryptic advice and, like, says a lot of things that people don't really understand at the time, but then they understand later. But he just kind of comes off as, like, this weird, dotty old man, but then as you learn more about him, you kind of see the method to his madness, and he was a lot more interesting. I actually would have preferred if the book was about him, and he became sort of the Sherlock Holmes, as I said, type, investigator who's investigating these murders. Seth really doesn't do a whole lot of actual investigating, which is weird because that's kind of how the book makes it sound like it will be. But he really just kind of stumbles into things, and Pewter and Nightshade just kind of like nudge him in the proper directions, but he doesn't really do a whole lot, unfortunately. So yeah, this one was just really disappointing. There's apparently sequels. I don't know if I'll read them. And this was the winner of the Times Children's Fiction Competition in 2016, apparently. I don't get it. This didn't really do it for me. I mean, maybe I was coming at it with the wrong sort of frame of mind. If I had come into it knowing it's not really about the murder mystery, maybe I could have gotten into it. But even as I say, even aside from that, just the characters were bland. The writing wasn't anything special. There was no real sense of like atmosphere or anything. So I was just very, just very, very meh. I didn't hate it, but it wasn't what I would call good in my opinion. So that was disappointing, but that was my next read. Then this was something I got from Waterstones in Lincoln. This is 1984, The Year Pop Went Queer by Ian Wade. This was actually really interesting. So I found out about this from I can't remember where, but I think I was reading a review on Pitchfork of like of Frankie Goes to Hollywood or Bronski Beat or something like that, and it mentioned this book. And it just sounded really interesting. So as anybody who knows me knows, I'm a big 80s pop music fan, 80s synth pop. new wave, all that kind of stuff. I love, Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode, If it's from the 80s and it's primarily synth-based, I will probably like it. And I've always been fascinated with, that whole era of 80s pop music and how it was very queer, as you say, as I say, and I mean, 1984 especially, which this book makes a case for. 84 was kind of, as it says, the year pop went queer, because in 84 you had bands like Culture Club, Pet Shop Boys, and especially in 84 you had Bronski Beat, you had Frankie Goes to Hollywood, you had Wham. So there's all this sort of like queer influence, as it's sort of like first sort of bursting into the mainstream in the UK, especially, which is where this the audience this book is primarily written for. So this is essentially a series of mix of like essays, biographies, retrospectives of again, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, Soft Cell, Pet Shop Boys, Bronski Beat, Divine, Hazel Dean. So each chapter is basically about a different artist. And yeah, it's really entertaining. Ian Wade writes in that sort of very loose, sort of a conversational, sort of a music journalist style, which, he is a music journalist, so that makes sense. And the thing that I really enjoyed about this book was that not only does it, explore sort of all of these different bands, but it explores kind of the history of sort of the gay experience at that time. So, it talks not only about AIDS, of course, but it goes into sort of a lot of the sort of feelings that were going on at the time in the culture. It talks about, the rise of like high energy music and sort of like how disco led into sort of post-disco and high energy and eventually, house music and all that kind of stuff. It talks about the progression of, how groups like Culture Club with, the gender-bending Boy George, kind of led to more, sort of gender-bending pop stars in the future. It talks about how gay icons like Madonna, who weren't necessarily queer themselves, but had huge queer followings, how those affected, sort of the pop divas of today and that kind of thing. And it goes into other sort of more political stuff too, like it talks about Section 28, which was the clause that basically prevented gay propaganda from being spread, and the British response to the AIDS virus, the miners' strikes, that kind of stuff, and how it all kind of comes together in this melange, during the 80s, this very tumultuous time. But there's a lot of sort of celebrations of queer joy as well, how this music paved the way for a lot of, young queer people. How, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, for example, like with their just very raw, sort of garish sexual energy really, showed people that it was, there was nothing wrong with, being out and proud. Talks about how, Bronski Beat, were very politically charged, and how, and they were sort of like the contrast to Frankie Goes to Hollywood, where they were a little bit more buttoned down and reserved, and kind of represented sort of the average gay man, all this stuff. And it's really, really a really fun and breezy read because, the chapters are short, and as I say, it's written in that very sort of breezy conversational style. I do wish, part of me wishes that it was a little bit more in-depth and a little bit more complex, but, it is meant to be sort of an entertaining sort of pop music book. It's not really meant to be sort of a serious study, but I just was enjoying it so much and learning all of these things, and learning about this era that I just wish it was a little bit longer. And there were a lot of things that I didn't really know about. Like it talks a little bit about Hazel Dean, who I was kind of aware of. She did that song "Searchin'" and a few things. And it talks about sort of the rise of like high energy, Patrick Cowley and Sylvester and all that. But it talked about some things that I didn't know about. Like there was this guy in 83, 84 called Marilyn, who was similar to Boy George in that he was very gender bending, very feminine. And he put out these, sort of high energy sort of pop singles, that were minor hits in the UK and stuff like that. Talks a little bit about the rise of like Stock Aitken Waterman. It talks about Divine and how she had a very, brief sort of illustrious pop career in the 80s, and how her songs led to the rise of the production group of Stock Aitken Waterman, who produced some of the biggest hits in the 80s, like, Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. So a lot of really interesting sort of factoids like that. Obviously, it doesn't focus entirely on 84. 84 is kind of the jumping off point, and as I say, it does specifically focus on 84 for a lot of the artists in the book, especially as I say, Frankie, Bronski Beat, that type of thing. And it doesn't go, but it does go. It does provide more of an overview. Like it gives you a brief overview of like before they went big, after they went big, but it does focus on 84 as kind of like the linchpin of like what he's like writing about, And of course, also there were some bands that I wish he talked more about, like he didn't mention Depeche Mode and stuff like that. Although people could argue that well, they're not really a queer band, but they did have a queer following, and they played on a lot of that sort of queer imagery, like with stuff like Master and Servant, and you had Martin Gore, wearing like the S&M gear and stuff like that. But it's also not just synth pop either. Like he talks about Judas Priest, Rob Halford, and he talks about Queen as well. So it's not just and the Smiths. So it's not just dance music. Although that obviously being a huge part of gay culture, and especially during the 80s, you can't really not talk about that. So that is the main focus of the book. So yeah, I mean, there's stuff that I liked about it. There's stuff that I wish was expanded on. But overall, I think it was a really quick, breezy, entertaining read. And if you like pop history and queer history, I would definitely check that out. Then finally, I started this halfway through December because I wanted to read it for Christmas, but I didn't end up finishing it till we were on the plane home. But this is The Nightmare Before Kissmas by Sara Raasch. You've probably seen this all over TikTok because I think it kind of blew up recently. I found out about it because it was all over the internet, and it just sounded really cute and cozy. So this takes place in a world where each holiday, they're almost like sort of I don't want to say mob family. They're like royal families, Each holiday has a royal family, and they all, work to sort of farm energy from sort of their followers, to which to sort of farm, which they use to power, their magic and stuff like that. And this book follows Nicholas Claus, who's also known as Cole, who's sort of the black sheep of the Claus family. He's the oldest, so he's in line to inherit the throne of Santa, but he's kind of grown disillusioned with Christmas. He sees it as more sort of corporate and fake and plasticky than it used to be. And he's sort of the class clown, Nobody really takes him seriously because he's always laughing and joking. And then the book opens with him really fucking up and sending and basically taking this small like third world country and granting all of their letters to Santa, granting all of them true, and it leads to sort of chaos and the destabilization of the economy and like riots and things, and he gets reprimanded for that. And while he's at a bar, sort of drinking away his sorrows, he meets this mysterious, dark young man who's smoky and sexy and pale, and they have sort of this intimate moment. And then a couple years later, as he's getting ready to graduate college, his dad basically says, "Oh, you're marrying the Easter princess," and it's meant to be a sort of PR stunt to sort of create an alliance between Christmas and Easter and to consolidate their power and that kind of thing. And Cole is best friends with the Easter princess, but they're not attracted to each other in that way, so it's like very tense for them. And then this guy shows up, the guy that he had the intimate moment with at the bar, who turns out to be Hex, who is the Prince of Halloween. And so Hex is also being sort of groomed as a potential suitor for Iris, the Easter princess. So it becomes this weird sort of not love triangle exactly, but sort of Hex and Cole are like really attracted to each other, but they have to keep up this facade of being, potential suitors for Iris and stuff, and about sort of the tension that arises from that. I was surprised how much I really enjoyed this. When I started it, I thought maybe, it'd just be a silly, sort of cozy little romance thing, maybe it would be a little fun. But I was really surprised with how deep the author, Sara Raasch, goes into the emotions of her characters. Like, it sounds ridiculous on the face of it, the Christmas as royal families, using the joy that's formed from people during the holidays, to power their magic, It sounds utterly ridiculous, but she treats it with, like, complete sincerity. And she actually finds a lot of sort of emotional truth in a lot of these characters, because they're royals, and so there's a lot of stuff about living up to the family name and taking on all the power of the throne. And Cole especially is dealing with sort of his feelings about Christmas, what it's become and what his father wants him to be, and whether they can be something else, if they can break the chains of, of what their family name has sort of shackled them under, So it's really in depth with like the emotions of the characters, and it even goes a little bit into sort of like sort of toxic families and like sort of intergenerational trauma and like emotional abuse and stuff like that. And it's really like surprisingly like serious at times, but at the same time it never forgets that that it's like a fluffy sort of romance, and it succeeds, I think, on a lot of fronts in that regard as well. Like they're very Hex is sort of the mischievous sort of Halloween spirit type. He's very well versed in like illusion magic, so he's always kind of playing pranks, which goes really well with Cole because he's sort of a very mischievous character as well, but he's more bright, whereas Hex is darker. I don't know, it's just very sweet and cute. And as I say, like, I really enjoyed the world building, surprisingly. As I say, there's all the stuff about them using the joy that's farmed from people during Christmas to sort of power their magic and stuff. And there's other stuff like, so this takes place in our world, but the royals, the holidays sort of like operate as separate entities, almost in kind of their own sort of little bubble world, a little bit like Harry Potter, where they have their own cities and their own citizens, and even their own tabloids, that like their own like paparazzi that like report on them and stuff like that. It was really, really interesting. And it's also just really goofy and funny. There's lots of stupid puns and stuff like that. A lot of Christmas-related humor. A lot of like sort of snarky sort of sarcasm, like you would expect from your typical sort of contemporary romance novel. But it's all very, very lighthearted and very cute. Which contrasts with the more serious moments. My only real criticism, and this is just a criticism I have of a lot of romance novels, I feel like they fall into things a little bit too quickly. I mean, I followed it through to the end, and I believed where it ended up, and I think it made sense. I do think they were a little quick to be proclaiming, I love you and things like that after only really having known each other for a couple weeks. Because the whole thing about this engagement is that it's announced at the beginning of December, and it's basically like you have till Christmas Eve to get, Christmas Day to get married and all that stuff. So they're really only hanging around each other seriously for like 2 or 3 weeks. So I don't know if I bought that they could have this sort of whirlwind romance. I don't know if I bought necessarily the, I love yous and I can't live without yous. But again, that's more just me and my own sort of personal sort of pet peeves with a lot of romance novels. I feel like a lot of characters in these books sort of rush into things too quickly, and they're saying I love you after only having known each other for a short while. But it is what it is. I also would have liked to have seen a little bit more of Halloween. I mean, it is really more about Christmas. It's a Christmas celebration, but we only get little snippets of Halloween and what that's like, and I would have really liked to have seen more of that. They do imply at towards the end of the book that Cole is going to visit him, in Halloween and learn more about him. I would have liked to have seen more of that, but there is going to be a sequel that focuses on his younger brother. And this does leave a few threads hanging that I assume will be answered in the second book, since the second book focuses on his younger brother. Although the brother ends up falling in love with a prince of St. Patrick's Day, apparently, which sounds pretty crazy. So, but I did really enjoy this, and I enjoyed it enough that I do really want to read the book. In fact, the sequel. In fact, I might pre-order it. It's not a spicy romance. There is some sex scenes, but it's very, very minor, and it's very sort of opaque and poetically presented. So it's not really that type of book, but it was really cute and cozy and funny. I just really enjoyed it, and way more than I thought I would. So I'm really, really glad I read it. So yeah, that was a nice way to sort of cap off the trip. So yeah, that was everything that I read while I was on vacation. Again, I'm sorry, I know it's taken me ages to get these videos out. I'm still working on my vlogs, but hopefully this will sort of hold you guys over until then. Hopefully you guys read some of these, and if you do, let me know what you think of them. Especially Kissmas, I'm curious what other people thought of it. But yeah, until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.